The first flakes of snow were not gentle. They were hard, like chips of bone flicked from a callous thumb, stinging my cheeks as I urged my mare, Hecate, through the final narrow pass. The mountains crouched on either side, vast and gray, their peaks already lost in the bruised belly of the sky. Before me, nestled in a fold of the unforgiving land, lay Silver Creek. It wasn't so much a town as it was a collection of wounds in the landscape. A ragged line of log buildings huddled together, their shoulders slumped against the coming onslaught. I wasn't here for the scenery. I was here for a man. Nolan Hogg, a nasty piece of work who'd earned himself the moniker the Ghost for his habit of slipping through passes like smoke. A $500 bounty said he was no ghost, just flesh and blood that could be made to bleed. That much money could see a man through a winter, maybe two. For me, it meant a brief respite from the gnawing memories that the cold always seemed to sharpen. As I rode onto the main thoroughfare, a generous term for the frozen river of mud and manure that split the town, a profound silence greeted me. It wasn't the quiet of a peaceful Sunday morning. It was the held-breath silence of a trapped animal. Windows were shuttered tight, not with curtains, but with rough-hewn planks. Wisps of smoke curled from a few chimneys, thin and fearful, as if trying not to draw attention. The only sound was the keening of the wind as it scraped its way between the buildings and the weary crunch of Hecate's hooves in the hardening ground. The sign for the saloon, the Mountain's Repose, creaked on its hinges, a lonely, rhythmic complaint. I swung down from the saddle, my limbs stiff from the cold, and looped Hecate's reins around the hitching post. The wood was so cold it felt sticky to my gloved hand. Pushing open the saloon doors, I stepped from the biting gray wind into a fug of stale whiskey, sweat, and something else. The thick, animal scent of fear. A dozen pairs of eyes shot toward me. They belonged to men who looked as weathered and beaten as the landscape outside. Prospectors with haunted eyes, a blacksmith whose shoulders were permanently stooped, a trapper still wrapped in furs that smelled of blood and pine. They weren't looking at a stranger. They were looking at an intruder, another mouth to feed in a long siege. A burly, red-faced bartender polished a glass with a rag that had seen better decades. "Whiskey," I said, my voice sounding loud in the hush. I dropped a coin on the scarred bar top. It rang with a dead, tinny sound. The bartender poured the drink without a word. I took a sip. It was rot gut, burning a trail down my throat, but it was warm. "I'm looking for a man," I began, letting my gaze sweep over the room. "Goes by Hogg." Nolan Hogg. Maybe you've seen him. A collective tension tightened the room. Men looked down into their glasses, at the floor, anywhere but at me. The bartender stopped polishing. "Ain't seen no one like that," he mumbled, his voice a low rumble. "He's got a $500 price on him. That kind of money can make a man's memory sharp." A grizzled prospector in the corner spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near my boot. "Your money's no good here, friend." "Not now." "Why's that?" He just shook his head, his eyes wide with a kind of frantic terror. He muttered something to his neighbor, and I caught the words, carried on the stale air. "Full moon comes, the blood snow." Before I could press him, the saloon doors swung open again, admitting a swirl of snow and a stooped figure wearing a tarnished silver star. The sheriff. He looked to be about 70, with a face like a crumpled map and hands that trembled with a palsy that had nothing to do with the cold. He trudged over to me, his eyes avoiding mine. "You a marshal?" "Graves," I said, not offering a hand. "Looking for Nolan Hogg." "You need to leave," the old man said, his voice a dry rustle. "You need to get on your horse and ride out before the pass is sealed." "I'm not leaving without my bounty." He finally met my eyes, and what I saw there wasn't the weariness of an old lawman. It was pure, bottomless dread. "Marshal, this storm is the least of our troubles. There are things in these mountains, things the snow brings. You get out now, or you'll be buried here with the rest of us." I'd seen fear in my life. I'd seen it in the eyes of boys at Antietam as the cannons opened up, and on the faces of killers just before the rope snapped tight. This was different. This was primal, irrational. I chalked it up to cabin fever, the madness that seeps into isolated places when the world shrinks to four walls and the howl of the wind. "I'll take my chances," I said, turning back to my drink. "I'll be taking a room for the night." The sheriff gave a low, defeated sigh and shuffled away. As he left, the wind outside rose from a moan to a full-throated scream. The snow was coming down thick and fast now, a blinding white curtain that erased the world. The pass would be closed. The old man was right about that much. I glanced through the saloon's grimy window. Across the street, the apothecary shop was dark, save for a single lantern. In its warm glow, I saw a figure standing perfectly still. He was a Chinese man dressed in a simple dark tunic, his face impassive. He wasn't looking at the storm. He was looking directly at me. His gaze was steady, analytical, as if he were observing a new species of insect that had wandered into his jar. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet, unnerving curiosity. "Mr. Jin Liao," the sign above his door read. By the time I finished my whiskey, night had fallen completely. One by one, the men in the saloon drained their glasses and shuffled out into the blizzard, heads bowed. I heard the solid, definitive thump of heavy bars dropping into place on doors up and down the street. The town was locking itself down. The bartender handed me a key. "Room 3. Upstairs. Don't go wandering." I took the stairs to a small, cold room with a bed, a wash basin, and a window that rattled in its frame. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of white fury. The wind howled like a legion of damned souls, a sound I knew well from winters on the plains. But beneath it, woven into the fabric of the storm, I felt something else. An expectant stillness. A palpable weight of dread that had settled over Silver Creek like the snow itself, burying it alive. I checked the action on my Colt, the familiar metallic click a small comfort in the growing darkness. I wasn't afraid of storms or of ghost stories told by scared old men. The only monsters I believed in were the ones that walked on two legs, and I was here to hunt one of them. The common room of the saloon was warmer than my rented cot, so I descended the creaking stairs, my hand resting on the butt of my Colt. The blizzard hadn't let up. If anything, its fury had intensified. It hammered against the building, and with every gust, the lanterns flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the corners of the room seem to writhe. A handful of men were still there, huddled around the pot-bellied stove like moths drawn to a dying flame. The bartender, a few prospectors, and a man in the black, rumpled clothes of a priest. I bought a bottle from the bartender and pulled a chair into their circle. The heat from the stove was a welcome relief, chasing some of the deep chill from my bones. "A long night," I said to the room at large. The men grunted in agreement, their eyes fixed on the glowing iron of the stove. "This storm bad enough to have you all spooked?" I pressed, pouring myself a measure of whiskey. "Or is it this mountain devil I've been hearing whispers about?" The question hung in the air, thick and unwelcome. It was the priest who finally broke the silence. He looked up, his face pale and puffy, his eyes swimming in a mixture of booze and sorrow. A fine white scar cut through his left eyebrow. "You're the marshal," he said, his voice thick with an Irish brogue that had been soaked in cheap whiskey. "Come for the ghost." "That's right." "You're hunting the wrong monster," he slurred, taking a long pull from his own glass. He gestured vaguely toward the rattling windows. "That one. It's not made of flesh and blood. Not like we are." "My name's Father Donovan," he introduced himself, though no one had asked. "Michael Donovan." He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "A shepherd whose flock is being devoured." I pushed the bottle toward him. "Tell me what you saw, Father." He didn't need much encouragement. The whiskey had already pried the lid off his grief. "It comes with the worst winters, when the moon is full and the snow is deep enough to bury our sins. It comes down from the peaks. The old miners, the Ute, they had stories. We called them tall tales." His voice cracked. "It's been 3 nights of the full moon. This is the second. 1 more to go." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, trembling whisper. "It took little Sarah Higgins. 8 years old. She wandered out to the privy not 50 feet from her door. Her father heard a scream. Just a little one. By the time he got his rifle and a lamp, she was gone. All that was left was a bit of red wool from her coat and the snow. So much blood on the snow." He buried his face in his hands. "I saw it. Just for a second. Up on the ridge behind their cabin. It was tall and thin, the color of old bone. And it moved so fast, Marshal. Not like a man, not like a beast. It just flowed across the snow. No tracks, nothing but the blood." I listened, my expression unreadable. My mind, a place of cold logic and hard experience, was already sifting through his words, looking for the facts amongst the fear. "A grizzly," I said, the words feeling solid and rational in my mouth. "Starving, driven down from the high country by the weather. They can be fast when they want to be, and a big one can stand on its hind legs, look almost like a man in the dark." One of the prospectors shook his head violently. "No bear did that to Sarah, or to the trapping party that went missing last month. They found their camp. Looked like a slaughterhouse. Traps sprung, rifles bent in half. A bear doesn't do that." "A pack of wolves, then," I countered. "Driven mad by hunger." But even as I said it, the explanation felt thin. The lack of tracks bothered me. Donovan was a drunk, but his terror was genuine. These men weren't fools, just scared. Fear makes people see things. War had taught me that. The chill in my bones had returned. A deep, persistent ache that the whiskey couldn't touch. I needed quinine. I stood up, leaving the bottle on the table. "I'll be back." The apothecary shop across the street was my destination. A small bell tinkled as I pushed the door open, stepping into a world of profound order. The air smelled of dried herbs, camphor, and something else. A clean, astringent scent like ozone after a lightning strike. Hundreds of glass jars and ceramic pots lined the shelves from floor to ceiling, each marked with neat Chinese characters. Behind the counter stood the man I'd seen in the window, Mr. Jin Liao. He was polishing a small brass scale with a soft cloth, his movements precise and economical. "I need quinine," I said. He nodded, not speaking, and turned to a set of wooden drawers. His silence wasn't hostile like the men in the saloon. It was simply complete. It was the quiet of a man who doesn't feel the need to fill the air with noise. As he measured out the bitter powder into a small paper envelope, my gaze wandered to the back room, visible through a beaded curtain. I saw a workbench, more jars, and a small clay crucible sitting over the low blue flame of an alcohol lamp. A faint metallic scent hung in the air from that direction, sharp and distinctive. I knew that smell. It was the smell of melting silver. Why would an apothecary be melting silver? Mr. Liao returned and placed the envelope on the counter. His dark, intelligent eyes met mine. There was an understanding in them, a recognition that I was not like the others huddled in the saloon. He saw the questions I hadn't asked. "For the fever," he said, his voice soft and unaccented. I paid him and turned to leave. "You don't seem worried about the town's devil," I remarked. He finished polishing his scale before answering. "Worry is a useless emotion, Marshal. Observation, preparation, these have value." I walked back across the street, the wind trying to tear the hat from my head. Back in my room, the blizzard raged. I lay on the lumpy mattress, fully dressed, my Colt resting on my chest. I tried to fit the pieces together: a starving bear, a pack of wolves, mass hysteria, but the image of Mr. Liao's crucible, the smell of silver, the priest's story of a thing that moved like smoke and left no tracks, they didn't fit. Sometime deep in the night, the storm seemed to hold its breath. In that brief pocket of silence, I heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a high, piercing sound from outside, a rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape. It sounded like a butcher sharpening a knife on a stone, or like long, hard nails being dragged slowly across frozen timber. It was a sound that set every nerve in my body on edge. Then it was shattered. A scream. Short, high-pitched, and filled with an agony so absolute it felt like a blade in my gut. It was a man's voice, but the terror in it was that of a child. The sound was cut off as cleanly as if a door had been slammed shut on it. And then, nothing but the returning howl of the wind, which now sounded like a triumphant, hungry roar. Downstairs in the saloon, the low murmur of conversation had ceased. The entire town was silent, listening to the darkness. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than the Montana winter, that I was not hunting a bear. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving behind a world transformed. Silver Creek lay buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow, at least 3 feet deep in the open. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray, and the air was so cold it felt like breathing powdered glass. The silence that followed the blizzard was heavy, reverent, like the quiet of a freshly filled graveyard. It didn't last long. A shout from the edge of town broke the stillness. It was a raw, panicked sound. I was already pulling on my coat and hat, my Colt heavy at my hip. When I stepped out of the saloon, the cold hit me like a physical blow. A small group of men were gathered near the livery stable, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They were staring at something on the ground. I pushed my way through. The man who screamed last night had been a lumberjack named Peterson, a big, sturdy fellow who, according to the sheriff, had foolishly decided to check on his mules. They found what was left of him 20 feet from his own woodshed. What was left was the operative phrase. "I've seen what cannon fire can do to a man. I've seen the aftermath of knife fights in dusty border towns. This was worse. It wasn't a killing. It was a butchering. His body had been torn apart with a force that seemed impossible. His rifle lay nearby, its stock shattered, the barrel bent at an obscene angle. It looked like a child's toy that had been snapped in a tantrum. The snow around him was a crimson disaster, a stark violation of the morning's white purity. but it was the tracks that made the blood freeze in my veins. The sheriff was pointing at them with a trembling hand. They weren't from a bear. They weren't from a wolf. They were deep, oblong prints in the snow, clearly made by something walking on two legs. But the stride was immense, easily 9 or 10 feet between steps. And at the end of each print were 3 long, deep gouges, the marks of claws that must have been 6 inches long. The tracks led from the direction of the high peaks, stopped at the carnage, and then retreated the way they came, disappearing into the thick timberline at the base of the mountain. 2 legs, impossible strength, and claws like scythes. My grizzly bear theory lay dead in the snow next to Peterson. I needed to clear my head. I needed to focus on the reason I came here. The town's hysteria was becoming contagious, and I had a job to do. "Sheriff?" I said, my voice hard. "You know anything about where Nolan Hogg and his boys might be holed up?" The old man looked at me, his eyes hollow. "There's an old mining cabin, about 2 miles north. Abandoned since the silver vein ran dry. A good place to hide from the weather and the law." "Show me on a map." Inside his cramped office, he drew a crude sketch on a piece of scrap paper. "You're a fool to go out there, Marshal. The woods ain't safe." "They're safer than this town right now," I retorted. The journey was slow and arduous. The snow was thigh-deep in places, and Hecate struggled, her breath coming in ragged bursts. The woods were unnaturally quiet, the kind of oppressive silence that presses in on you, where the only sound is the frantic beat of your own heart. No birds called, no squirrels chittered in the branches. Even the wind seemed to have died. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. The trees, heavy with snow, looked like skeletal sentinels guarding a forbidden path. After an hour that felt like a lifetime, I saw it through the trees. A small, dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, settled in my gut. I dismounted, pulling my rifle from its scabbard, and approached on foot. The first thing I noticed was the door. It wasn't broken down. It was gone. Ripped clean from its iron hinges and tossed 20 feet away into a snowdrift. The wood was splintered and shredded, gouged with the same 3-claw pattern I'd seen by the livery. I moved to the threshold, rifle raised, and peered inside. The interior was cast in a deep, gloomy twilight. The air was frigid and thick with the coppery, metallic smell of blood. 3 figures were sprawled across the small room. Nolan Hogg and his 2 associates. The men I had ridden 200 miles to find. They were dead, all of them. Dead in the same horrific way as the lumberjack. It was a scene of absolute carnage. A table was overturned, cards scattered across the floor. Pistols lay where they had fallen from dead hands, all of them empty. They had put up a fight. A futile, desperate one. Hogg, the ghost, lay near the cold fireplace, his famous pearl-handled revolver still clutched in a rigor mortis grip. His chest was a gaping cavity, but it was the walls that told the story. Deep, parallel furrows were scored into the log walls, running from floor to ceiling. The wood was stripped away in long ribbons, as if an industrial rake had been dragged across it. Whatever had done this had been tall, powerful, and enraged. It had cornered 3 armed men in a tiny cabin and torn them to pieces as easily as I might tear a piece of paper. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the cabin broken only by the drip of melting snow from the eaves. The $500 bounty poster in my pocket felt like a mockery. This wasn't the work of a man. It wasn't the work of any animal I had ever known or heard of. It was something else entirely. something ancient and predatory that had come down from the mountains to claim this valley as its hunting ground. The sheriff's words came back to me. "You're hunting the wrong monster." He was right. And now, its hunt and mine had officially crossed paths. The world I knew, a world of logic, gunpowder, and human greed, suddenly felt very small and very fragile. The ride back to Silver Creek was different. The unnatural silence of the forest no longer felt merely unsettling. It felt accusatory. Every snow-laden branch looked like a pale, skeletal arm. Every shadow seemed to hold a tall, thin shape. The pragmatism that had been my armor for 20 years, forged in the crucible of war and hardened on the frontier, had been shattered. I had seen the work of men at their worst, but this was a different kind of violence. This was primal, alien. This was the violence of a fable come to life. I didn't stop at the sheriff's office or the saloon. I dismounted in front of the apothecary, the tinkling of the bell above the door sounding like a summons. Mr. Jin Liao was behind the counter, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. He looked up as I entered, his expression calm, as if he had been expecting me. "The quinine didn't work," I said, my voice raw. I unbuckled my gun belt and laid my Colt on his pristine counter. The gesture was not a threat, but a concession. This was a problem my gun, in its current state, couldn't solve. "I found Hogg and his men. They're dead. Torn to ribbons, just like the lumberjack. I saw the tracks. I saw the cabin." I leaned forward, my hands flat on the wood. "You're the only person in this town who isn't paralyzed by fear. You're watching. You're preparing. You knew this was coming. Now you're going to tell me what in God's name we're dealing with." Liao stopped his grinding. He carefully wiped his hands on a clean cloth, his movements deliberate. He looked from my face to the revolver, then back again. For a long moment he was silent. Then he nodded, a small, sharp gesture of decision. "Come," he said, gesturing toward the beaded curtain. I followed him into the back room. It was even more meticulously organized than the shop. Shelves held not just herbs, but anatomical charts, geological maps of the region, and several leather-bound books, their spines embossed with characters I couldn't read. He walked to a large, flat-topped chest and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark silk, was an ancient, rolled-up scroll. He carefully unrolled it on the workbench. The parchment was yellowed with age, the ink faded. It was covered in elegant, flowing script and illustrations. The drawings depicted a creature of nightmare. It was tall and emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its skin was pale gray, stretched tight over a cage of prominent ribs. It had no hair, no lips, only a wide, lipless mouth filled with needle-like teeth. Its hands and feet ended in long, black talons. In one illustration, it stood over a dismembered body in the snow, its featureless white eyes staring out from the page. "My grandfather was a scholar and a physician to the emperor before he came to this country to build the railroads," Liao explained, his voice low and even. "He collected stories, histories of things that live in the high, cold places of the world. They are called by many names. In his homeland, Gui a hungry ghost. The natives here, the Ute, called it something that means the spirit of the long winter. It is not a demon, Marshal. It is a predator, an ancient one." He tapped a finger on the scroll. "It hibernates for years, sometimes decades, deep within the mountains. It only wakes during the harshest winters, when the full moon coincides with a blizzard that cuts its territory off from the world. It wakes to hunt, to feed, to store energy for the long sleep to come. And it's immune to lead," I stated. remembering the spent cartridges in the cabin. Its hide is thick, its bones dense as stone, Liao confirmed. But its nature is wrong. It is a creature that should not be. It exists in defiance of the natural order. He moved to the small forge where I had seen the crucible. From a wooden box, he took out 6 newly cast bullets. They shone with the soft, pure light of silver. Lead is common. It is of the earth, he said, lining the bullets up on the counter. Silver is pure, noble. In the old texts, it is said to be a bane to unnatural things. It does not simply pierce its flesh, it burns it. It unmakes it. It reminds the creature of its own wrongness. He slid the 6 bullets toward me. My hands are skilled with medicine and scales. Yours are steadier with a firearm. I believe these belong to you. I picked one up. It was heavier than a lead round of the same size. It felt cold, pure, and deadly. My next stop was the church. The building was empty, cold, and smelled of dust and decay. I found Father Donovan kneeling at the altar, not in prayer but hunched over, his head in his hands. The air around him was free of the stench of whiskey. He was sober, and that seemed to make his fear all the more potent. "I was wrong, Father," I said from the nave. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and full of a terrible clarity. "So you've seen it then? Seen its work? Hogg and his men are dead. The cabin, God." The word felt foreign on my tongue. "You said you saw it. What did it look like?" "Pale," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Like bone in the moonlight. Starlight just slid off it. And the eyes. No, not eyes. Just 2 dark holes. But I felt them looking. I felt them, weighing my soul." He crossed himself, a gesture that seemed more habit than faith. "Liao thinks silver can hurt it." I showed him one of the bullets. A flicker of something, not hope, but perhaps resolve, ignited in the priest's eyes. "Then God has given us a weapon. He's also given us 4 walls and a stone foundation," I said, looking around the sturdy church. "This is the most defensible building in town. The storm is supposed to last 1 more night. 1 more night of the full moon." Donovan stood up, his spine straightening. The drunken, broken priest was gone. In his place was a man who had found a new, desperate purpose. "We can survive. We must. We need to fortify this place," I said, my mind shifting into the familiar territory of tactics and defense. "Barricade the doors, board the windows, gather every lamp, every rifle, and every able-bodied man who hasn't lost his nerve. We're not hiding from it tonight, we're making a stand." Together we walked out into the cold gray afternoon. We went from the saloon to the general store, gathering the few men who hadn't been broken by terror. There weren't many: the blacksmith, the sheriff, a couple of old prospectors. But as we began hauling heavy wooden pews to barricade the great oak doors and nailing thick planks over the stained glass windows, a fragile sense of purpose began to bind us together. We were no longer scattered, terrified sheep. We were a small, desperate garrison, preparing for a siege against the devil himself. As twilight bled across the snow-covered landscape, staining it a deep bruised purple, the last of us filed into the church. The air inside was thick with the scent of lamp oil, old wood, and the raw, acrid smell of human fear. We were maybe a dozen souls in total. The last remnants of Silver Creek's courage huddled together in the cold, cavernous space. The massive oak doors were barred with 2 heavy pews and the blacksmith's anvil. Every window, even the high arching ones near the ceiling, was a patchwork of nailed-up planks. The only light came from a dozen lanterns placed around the nave. their flickering glow creating a small island of warmth in an ocean of encroaching darkness. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, the vanguard of the night's blizzard. It moaned around the stone corners of the church, a low, mournful sound that set my teeth on edge. We waited. That was the hardest part. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each one marked by the frantic ticking of the sheriff's pocket watch. Men gripped their rifles, their knuckles white. The blacksmith held a heavy smithing hammer. Father Donovan clutched a large silver crucifix, his lips moving in a silent, constant prayer. I stood near the main door, my newly loaded Colt feeling both heavy and inadequate in my hand. I had chambered one of Liao's silver bullets, with the other 5 nestled safely in my coat pocket. The rest were standard lead. I needed to make that first shot count. Then, the wind died down, abruptly. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the howling. And in that silence, we heard it. Scrape, scrape, thump. It came from above, from the roof. The sound was dry and sharp, the noise of something hard and heavy moving with an unnatural agility across the wooden shingles. It was heavier than a man, but it moved with the lightness of a spider. A collective gasp went through the room. Men looked up at the high, vaulted ceiling, their faces pale in the lantern light. The scraping moved across the length of the roof, slow and deliberate. It was testing, exploring. This was no mindless beast. This was an intelligent hunter, examining the perimeter of our trap. The sound stopped directly above the altar, and for a long minute, there was nothing. The tension was a physical thing, a wire pulled taut to the point of snapping. Then, a new sound began. A soft, rhythmic scratching at one of the high, boarded-up windows. Like a rat behind a wall, but deeper, more resonant. The sound of a single, long claw testing the strength of the wood, searching for a weakness. It moved from one window to the next, a patient, methodical inspection that frayed our nerves raw. Suddenly, a new sound echoed from outside the main doors, cutting through the night. It was the sound of a child crying. A little girl sobbing for her mother. "Mama, Papa, I'm scared." A man near me, one of the prospectors named Silas, whose daughter had been taken by cholera the previous winter, let out a strangled cry. "Mary? Is that you?" He scrambled toward the door, his eyes wide with a grief-stricken madness. "Mary, I'm here." Before he could touch the barricade, the blacksmith and I grabbed him, wrestling him back. "Silas, stop." "It's not her," I hissed, my voice tight. "It's a trick. Let me go. That's my little girl." He wept, struggling against us. Father Donovan rushed over, holding his crucifix before the man's face. "Silas, listen to me. That is not your child. It is a mockery, a blasphemy. Do not listen to the devil's lies." The crying outside continued, heartbreakingly real. But now, woven beneath it, we could hear a low, guttural clicking, a sound of anticipation. The creature was smart. It knew our pains, our losses. It was using our own hearts as a weapon against us. Silas finally collapsed, sobbing, and the crying outside faded, replaced by an enraged hiss of frustration. The trick had failed. I moved to one of the smaller windows near the side chapel, one I had boarded up myself. A tiny sliver of a gap, no wider than a nickel, remained between two of the planks. Heart pounding, I pressed my eye to the opening and peered into the swirling snow and darkness. For a moment I saw nothing. Then, a shape coalesced from the gloom. It was standing not 30 feet away, partially obscured by the flurry. It was tall, impossibly so, and painfully thin. A walking skeleton draped in pale grayish skin that seemed to drink the faint moonlight. Its arms were long, ending in hands with fingers like black, crooked branches. It turned its head, and for a fraction of a second I saw its face. There was no nose, just two vertical slits. No lips, just a lipless gash that stretched across its lower face. And its eyes. Father Donovan was right. They were not eyes. They were two deep, black pits of absolute emptiness that seemed to burn with a cold, hungry light. As it looked toward the church, I felt a violation, a sense of being seen and assessed not as a man, but as a piece of meat. I pulled back from the window, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. That single fleeting glance was enough to confirm every impossible story. As if sensing it had been seen, the creature let out a shriek that was nothing like the child's cry. It was a high, thin, piercing sound like metal shearing metal, a noise that bypassed the ears and drilled straight into the skull. Then came the impact. Boom! The entire church shuddered as the creature threw itself against the main doors. The thick oak groaned, and dust rained down from the rafters. The men cried out in alarm. Boom! A second impact, harder this time. A long vertical crack appeared in one of the door panels. The barricade of pews shifted, the anvil scraping inches across the stone floor. It was trying to break through with sheer brute force.
Boom! Crack!
Splinters flew inward. The hinges screamed in protest. We piled more benches against the barricade, our movements frantic and desperate. The thing outside was a living battering ram, a creature of single-minded destructive fury. We pushed. We prayed. We cursed. We held on through an eternity of splintering wood and monstrous impacts. The assault continued relentlessly, a percussive nightmare hammering at the very foundations of our sanctuary. And then, as the first faint hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, it stopped. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by our own ragged, desperate breathing. We stood frozen, listening, waiting for the next blow. But it never came. We had survived. We had survived the second night. But as I looked at the shattered, nearly breached doors, I knew with a chilling certainty that we would never survive a third. The dawn revealed the full extent of the night's assault. The great oak doors were a wreck, one of them hanging crookedly on a single tortured hinge. The wood was deeply scored and splintered, with several large, fist-sized holes punched clean through. Outside, the stone walls of the church were scarred with enormous claw marks, the gouges so deep it looked as though a giant had tried to claw his way through the solid rock. The creature's fury had been awesome. Its strength was beyond comprehension. We stared at the damage, the brief elation of survival evaporating into the cold morning air, replaced by a grim, shared understanding. The church was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb waiting to be sealed. "It will get in tonight," the blacksmith said, his voice flat with exhaustion and defeat. "That door won't hold against another push." He was right. Panic began to bubble up among the small group of survivors. Talk turned to running, to trying to make a break for it through the snow-choked passes. It was suicide, and we all knew it. "We can't run," I said, my voice cutting through the rising murmur of fear. "And we can't hide. That leaves one option." All eyes turned to me. "We fight." The sheriff let out a hollow laugh. "Fight? With what, Marshal?" "We saw what our rifles did." "Nothing." "Not with lead," I said, pulling one of the silver bullets from my pocket and holding it up in the pale morning light. "With this, and with fire." My mind, accustomed to the geometry of ambushes and last stands, was racing. Hiding had failed. Fortifying had failed. We couldn't fight it on its terms out in the open where its speed and strength gave it every advantage. We had to change the battlefield. We had to lure it into a place of our own choosing, a place where we could hurt it. "The blacksmith's forge," I said, the idea taking shape. "It has thick stone walls, a narrow entrance we can control, and one thing that creature has never faced before, a furnace." The blacksmith, a man named Gunner, looked at me, his eyes widening as he understood. "The great bellows. We can get the forge hot enough to melt steel." "Exactly," I said. "We make a killing box. We lure it inside and we burn it." The plan was born of pure desperation, a wild gamble against impossible odds, but it was better than waiting for death in the dark. A flicker of hope, however faint, returned to the men's eyes. The role of the bait was unspoken. It fell to me. I was the outsider. I was the one with the silver bullets. And if I was being honest with myself, I was the only one with the cold-blooded resolve to stand face to face with that thing and not break. The war had burned the panic out of me long ago, replacing it with a hard, cold core of purpose. "I'll draw it in," I said, the words tasting like iron. "I'll lead it from here to the forge. You men get there now. Get that furnace roaring. I want it white-hot by nightfall." The rest of the day was a blur of frantic activity. While Gunnar and the others worked at the forge, sending thick plumes of black smoke into the winter sky, I made my own preparations with Mr. Liao and Father Donovan. Liao, ever the scientist, worked on the lure. He took a bucket and filled it with pig's blood from the town's nearly empty larder. To this, he added a pungent mixture of herbs and oils, valerian root, sulfur, and something else that smelled sharp and musky. "Its sense of smell is likely its most powerful tool," he explained as he stirred the foul-smelling concoction. "The scent of blood will draw it. This mixture, its scent is offensive, unnatural. It will mask our own fear and create a clear trail for it to follow, a trail that irritates and angers it. It will follow the scent not just with hunger, but with aggression." While Liao worked his strange chemistry, I found Father Donovan back in the ruined church. He was standing before the altar, not kneeling this time. He had cleaned himself up, and in his hands he held the large silver crucifix. He was no longer the broken drunk from the saloon or the terrified man from the night before. His face was calm, imbued with a quiet, solemn resolution. He had found his faith again, not in the safety of Scripture, but in the face of an imminent battle against a creature of profound evil. "I will be at the forge with you, Marshal Graves," he said, his voice steady. "I need you with the others, Father. At the bellows." "Mr. Liao will assist with the fire," he countered. "My place is by your side." For years, I have spoken of the battle between good and evil as a metaphor. I see now that it is not. It is real, and it is fought with iron and silver and faith. Tonight, I will be a soldier of God once more. There was no arguing with the conviction in his eyes. He had made his peace. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long blue shadows across the snow, the three of us stood outside the forge. The heat from within was a palpable force, the roar of the furnace a constant, hungry thunder. The air was filled with a sense of finality. This was it. There would be no more hiding, no more surviving. Tonight, we were the hunters. I checked my Colt one last time. 5 lead rounds, and in the 6th chamber, a single silver bullet. The other 4 were in my pocket, a small, heavy weight of hope. We weren't defending our lives anymore. We were launching a suicidal attack on a nightmare. And as the last light of day vanished and the temperature plummeted, I looked toward the mountains and wondered if I had just signed all our death warrants. Night fell like a hammer blow, bringing with it an absolute darkness and a cold so intense it felt like a living entity. The wind had returned, whispering through the skeletal trees, carrying the first stinging flakes of a new blizzard. The stage was set. With a grim sense of purpose, I took the bucket of blood and herbs prepared by Liao. Starting from the ravaged doors of the church, I began to lay the trail. I didn't just pour it. I kicked over a sled, splattering the blood across it as if a body had been dragged away. I smeared it on the side of the general store, on the hitching post in front of the saloon. I made it look like a trail of carnage, a desperate, messy retreat ending at one place: the wide open doors of the blacksmith's forge. Inside, the heat was a physical shock. The great forge in the center of the room glowed with a terrifying white-hot intensity. Gunnar and the others had done their work. The air shimmered, and the roar of the flames, fed by the massive bellows worked by Liao and the sheriff, was a deafening, all-consuming sound. Father Donovan stood near the forge, his face illuminated by the fire, his silver crucifix held tight in his hands. I took my position in the shadows near the entrance, opposite the glowing maw of the furnace. My Colt was in my hand, the hammer cocked. Now, all we could do was wait. The waiting was always the worst part. Every gust of wind sounded like its approach. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into its lanky form. It didn't take long. A sudden silence fell outside as the wind momentarily died. And in that silence, we heard it. A wet, sniffing sound. The sound of a predator catching a scent on the air. It was followed by a low, guttural hiss of mingled hunger and rage. It had found my trail. I heard it move, not with the heavy scrape from the church roof, but with a series of quick, furtive scuttles. The sound was wrong, jerky and unnatural, the movement of a broken thing. It was close. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the roar of the forge. A shape blotted out the faint starlight in the doorway. It was taller than I remembered, so tall it had to stoop to enter the forge. Its long, spider-like arms, tipped with those horrifying black talons, nearly scraped the dirt floor. It paused on the threshold, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the snowy night. It slowly raised its head, the two black pits that served as eyes scanning the roaring, firelit interior. It was a thing of shadow and bone, of deep cold and ancient hunger. And as it drew in a long, rattling breath, its gaze locked onto me. There was no time for thought, only action. I raised the Colt and fired. The lead bullet struck it square in the chest with a sound like a hammer hitting frozen meat. The impact barely made it flinch. It looked down at the new hole in its torso with what seemed like mild curiosity, then looked back at me, a low growl rumbling in its chest. I fired again. And again. The bullets either ricocheted off its dense bones with a whining shriek or punched clean through its pale flesh, leaving neat, bloodless holes that seemed to cause it no pain at all. It was like shooting at a ghost. It let out a sharp, clicking hiss and launched itself forward. It didn't run. It flowed, covering the 20 feet between us in a single, terrifying bound. I had only one shot left before I had to reload. The silver one. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the talons of its right hand extended, reaching for my face. I aimed for its shoulder, the largest target, and squeezed the trigger. Bang! The sound of the shot was different, sharper. The silver bullet struck home. The result was instantaneous and violent. A sound erupted from the creature, a deafening shriek that was half rage and half agony. Where the bullet hit, Its pale flesh sizzled and blackened as if touched by a white-hot poker. Acrid gray smoke poured from the wound, smelling of ozone and burning meat. The creature recoiled, clutching its shoulder, its shriek echoing off the stone walls. This was no ghost. This could feel pain. Enraged, blinded by a pain it had perhaps never known, it abandoned its attack on me and charged blindly forward. It was exactly what I had hoped for. I threw myself to the side, rolling across the dusty floor. The creature, propelled by its own momentum and rage, hurtled past me. Its trajectory carried it directly in front of the roaring, white-hot furnace. The wave of incandescent heat washed over it, and for the first time, the creature seemed to know fear. It reared back, hissing like a snake, its pale skin charring and blistering from the radiant heat alone. It was trapped, pinned between a man with a weapon that could truly harm it and a wall of man-made sun. The gambit had worked. The beast was in the killing box. The creature was a whirlwind of pain and fury. It spun around, its blackened shoulder smoking, its featureless eyes fixing on me with an intensity that promised a swift and brutal death. I fumbled in my pocket, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline, trying to reload the Colt. The tiny silver bullets felt slippery in my trembling hand. I was too slow. It lunged, crossing the floor in a blur of pale limbs and black talons. There was no time to aim, no time to even raise the gun. It slammed into me, not with its claws, but with the force of its body, and I was thrown backward like a rag doll. My head connected with a stack of iron bars with a sickening crack. Stars exploded behind my eyes, and the world tilted crazily. My revolver flew from my grasp, skittering away into the deep shadows in the corner of the forge. I was disarmed, dazed, and at its mercy. It stood over me, its immense height blocking the light from the furnace. It let out a low, triumphant chuffing sound, like a wolf over a fresh kill. It raised its clawed hand, the one not burned by silver, preparing for the final disemboweling strike. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. The voice clear and strong cut through the roar of the forge. Father Donovan. I rolled my head to the side, my vision swimming. The priest was no longer standing by the altar of his faith. He was standing by the altar of the forge. He held not a crucifix, but a long iron poker, its tip glowing a brilliant incandescent orange from the heart of the furnace. His face was serene, illuminated by the hellish light filled with a terrifying, righteous purpose.
"Your master is chaos and death," he shouted, his voice ringing with a conviction I never thought he possessed. "But my God is a God of light and fire."
With a final prayer on his lips, a prayer not of petition but of war, he charged. He didn't hesitate. He ran straight at the creature's flank, screaming a Gaelic war cry that was likely ancient when Rome was still a village. He thrust the glowing poker forward with all his might. The superheated iron plunged deep into the creature's side. The shriek it let out was apocalyptic. It was a sound of such profound agony that the very stones of the forge seemed to tremble. The creature's flesh sizzled and melted around the poker, sending up clouds of stinking smoke. It was a wound far more grievous than the one from my silver bullet. But its agony made it impossibly fast. It spun, ignoring the priest, ignoring the molten iron buried in its side, and swiped its clawed hand in a wide, vicious arc. The blow caught Father Donovan in the chest, sending him flying backward. He slammed against the far stone wall and slid to the floor in a broken heap. He had bought me time. Scrambling on my hands and knees, my head throbbing, I searched the shadows for my gun. My fingers brushed against the cold steel of the barrel. I snatched it up. The creature was writhing, pulling the still glowing poker from its side. It was grievously wounded, but its rage seemed to fuel it, to hold its unnatural form together. I managed to thumb one of the remaining silver bullets from my pocket and slot it into the empty chamber. It was all I had time for. One shot. The creature finally tore the poker free and hurled it away. It clanged against the stone floor, a discarded instrument of martyrdom. It turned its full attention back to me. It was limping now, smoking from 2 separate wounds, but its eyes burned with a hatred that was eternal. It took a step toward me, its lipless mouth stretching into a silent snarl. I raised the Colt with both hands to steady my shaking arms. I didn't aim for the body. I remembered the scroll in Liao's shop, the way the head was depicted as the seat of its unnatural existence. Face to face with the impossible, I took a breath, held it, and aimed for the center of that featureless, horrifying face. "Go to hell," I breathed, and pulled the trigger. There was no wet smack of lead hitting bone. Instead, the moment the silver bullet struck, a deafening crack, like a massive tree splitting in a lightning strike, echoed through the forge. The creature's head didn't just rupture, it detonated. A concussive blast of icy vapor and fine black dust erupted from its neck, and the 2 dark pits that were its eyes flared with a final searing white light before being extinguished forever. Its lanky body went rigid, a tremor running through it from its clawed feet to its smoking shoulders. Then it collapsed. It didn't fall like a man or an animal. It crumpled in on itself, folding like a child's paper toy. As it lay on the dirt floor, a bizarre transformation took place. The pale, leathery skin rapidly darkened, cracked, and flaked away. The flesh beneath seemed to evaporate, turning to dust and smoke. Within a minute, all that was left was a pile of blackened, brittle-looking bones and a drift of fine gray ash that smelled faintly of static and cold stone. The monster had been unmade. The roar of the furnace was the only sound. I staggered to my feet, my head pounding, and rushed to Father Donovan's side. He lay crumpled against the wall, his chest a ruin. His breathing was a shallow, wet rattle, but his eyes were open and clear. A faint, peaceful smile touched his lips. "He hears," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the high, smoke-stained ceiling. "After all this time, he hears me." His eyes fluttered closed, and the last breath sighed out of him. The shepherd had laid down his life for his flock. As if on cue, Mr. Liao appeared at my side. He must have seen the whole thing from his post at the bellows. He placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, his calm presence an anchor in the chaotic aftermath. He looked from the priest's peaceful face to the pile of ash on the floor and simply nodded. He helped me limp out of the oppressive heat of the forge and into the biting cold of the dawn. The 3rd night was over. The blizzard had passed, leaving the world scoured and silent under a sky the color of pearl. Slowly, hesitantly, the survivors began to emerge from the barricaded buildings where they had hidden. They saw me, wounded and covered in soot. They saw Mr. Liao at my side, and they saw the smoke still curling from the forge, a pyre for both a monster and a hero. They looked at the silent, snow-covered mountains, and for the first time in days, there was no fear in their eyes, only grief and a profound, exhausted relief. Later that morning, I went back into the forge alone. The fire had died down to a dull red glow. The pile of ash and bone was still there, looking impossibly mundane in the daylight. I sifted through the dust until my fingers found them. My silver bullets. 5 of them. They were misshapen, partially melted blobs of metal, their purity scarred by contact with the unholy creature. I picked them up and pocketed them. Souvenirs from a war no one would ever believe I fought. I took the wanted poster for Nolan Hogg from my pocket. $500. It seemed like a fortune 3 days ago. Now it was just a piece of paper, a relic from a simpler, more logical world. I crumpled it up and tossed it into the dying embers of the forge. It flared up and vanished, the ghost's final, meaningless disappearance. Mr. Liao tended to the gash on my head and the deep bruises that were already coloring my ribs. He worked in his usual efficient silence, applying a pungent-smelling salve that numbed the pain. We didn't speak of what happened. We didn't need to. We were two men from opposite ends of the earth who had stood together at the edge of the abyss and refused to be dragged in. We both knew the world was older, stranger, and filled with more teeth than the sane, modern man could ever admit. Some knowledge doesn't require words. It leaves scars instead. 2 days later, the world began to melt. A warm Chinook wind swept down from the mountains, and the iron grip of winter began to loosen its hold on Silver Creek. The snow softened, the icicles wept, and the frozen mud of the main street turned to a thick, slushy mire. The road out would soon be passable. The town held a funeral for its dead. They were buried in the small, wind-swept cemetery behind the now-repaired church. They buried the lumberjack Peterson, and they buried Father Michael Donovan. The priest was laid to rest with a reverence usually reserved for saints. The story of his sacrifice had already become legend, a tale to be told for generations by the fire on long winter nights, a light to hold against the darkness they now knew was real. I spent the time healing, preparing to leave. The new town sheriff, the blacksmith Gunner, offered me a portion of the town's treasury as a reward. "You saved us, Marshal," he'd said, his voice rough with emotion. I turned him down. I hadn't done it for money. I had done it to survive, and somewhere along the way, I had done it for them. For the priest who found his faith at the end of a hot poker. I had enough ghosts in my past. I didn't need to add a town's worth of them to the collection. On the morning of my departure, I stopped by the apothecary. Mr. Liao was waiting for me. We stood for a moment in the quiet, herb-scented shop. He handed me a small, oiled leather pouch with a drawstring. It was heavy. I opened it. Inside were 3 more silver bullets, perfectly cast, shining with a cool, lunar light. "Just in case," he said, his voice as calm as ever. "The world is a very large place, Marshal Graves." I nodded, unable to find the right words. "Thank you, Jin." It was the first time I had used his given name. He inclined his head slightly. "Travel safely." I swung myself up onto Hecate's back. The saddle leather creaked under my weight. Before turning her toward the pass, I took one last look at Silver Creek. It was still a broken, hard-scrabble town, but it was alive. Smoke rose confidently from its chimneys now. Children were playing in the slush, their laughter echoing in the clear mountain air. Then I looked up at the mountains. The peaks of the Rockies stood impassive and majestic against the blue sky, their snow caps gleaming in the sun. They no longer looked like just rock and ice to me. They were a wall between my world and another, older one. I knew what slumbered in their deep, cold heart, and I knew that one day, in some other harsh winter, it might wake again. Or perhaps something else like it would. I nudged Hecate into a walk, leaving Silver Creek behind me. In many ways, I was the same man who had ridden in. Marshal Graves, a bounty hunter, a veteran who believed in the simple math of a gunfight. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. The world was no longer a straightforward map of good men, bad men, and the money that passed between them. I now knew there were shadows in the corners of that map, ancient things that preyed on anyone who strayed too far from the firelight. As I rode down the thawing, muddy pass, my hand instinctively went to the Colt at my hip. I could feel the weight of it, the cold, comforting steel, but it felt different now. In my mind, I pictured the cylinder, 5 lead rounds for the evil that men do, and one chamber always empty, always waiting, reserved for a silver bullet. I was still a hunter, but I wasn't just hunting men anymore. I was hunting the darkness itself.